So welcome everyone to the latest in the employee series of webinars that we're doing for the Kickstart scheme. I'll quickly hand you over to Gemma, who those who saw a webinar the other day will know how beneficial she is to the entire process and what an expert she is on her subject. But I'll let Gemma introduce herself because I don't want to do her down in any way. So over to you, Gemma.
Thank you very much. All right. Hello, everybody. So I work for an organisation called People Building. I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of what we do there. I'll tell you a little bit about who I am and what my background is. And then we're going to be tackling the issue of anxiety today. And I can tell you in advance that an hour is not going to be nearly long enough because when it comes to anxiety, there's probably quite a lot we can say about it. So going back to my organisation, People Building, we're a company that specialise in mental and emotional wellbeing resources for employees and employers. And so we have a platform of articles, videos, webinars, podcasts, all of which are designed to help maintain mental and emotional wellness within a team. And we do that by providing cost-effective ways to address mental health in the workplace. We also provide unlimited free consultations for reactive solutions during times of crisis. And even if you don't need to have been an employee or an employer to go through a time of crisis in your life. So knowing that there are professionals that you can just hop on the phone, reach out to, set up something like this, a Zoom meeting with, to be able to, just get some tips that move you in the right direction is really valuable. And we use NHS approved assessments and measures that provide evidence of effectiveness that can then be used by HR teams to support or challenge employees to make sure that you are fit to get back to work if indeed you've taken some time off. So in terms of who I am a trainer of a discipline called NLP, which stands for Neurolinguistic Programming. It's an alternative therapy. It's a little bit like a cognitive behaviour therapy. And I have a team of practitioners who are dotted all over the UK who have been trained by me to also use that discipline too. So I use my NLP skills, although it can be applied in lots of different contexts. I specifically use it in the area of mental health and wellness. I'm also a franchisor, so I have a team of people that work with me promoting my products and programs. I'm an entrepreneur and a content creator, so I'm also a hypnotherapist. One of the products that I've created the most is stuff around hypnosis. I'm a YouTuber, a podcaster, an author, and most importantly, I'm an employer who was once an employee for a significant period of time. And I certainly have had my fair share of feeling anxious in a workplace situation, both as an employer and an employee, but certainly as an employee. And prior to doing this webinar with you today, I was actually sort of thinking back on the times when I would get anxious in a work-based scenario. And thinking back on it now with the benefit of hindsight, I can see how almost a bit crazy my brain would become, and quite creative at coming up with different worst case scenarios that might happen or that I might have accidentally created in my different work-based situations. And that really ties in with what anxiety is all about, because anxiety is this sense of worry or nervousness, an unease or an uncertainty about an outcome. So it's about something that hasn't happened yet. Anxiety is very forward focused. It's on what might happen in the future. It can be mild. It can in some cases be severe, and it can also escalate. So for some people, anxiety can lead to other sorts of disorders such as panic attacks. Quite often we see that there is a connection between anxiety and feelings of depression. In fact, the same medication is used to treat both anxiety and depression because of how they work in our brain chemistry. And they cause physical changes in the body. So when someone is feeling anxious, they're going to notice that there is a change in how they physically operate their body, and that can be very different for different people. For some, they may get hot, other people might get cool and clammy. Some people will notice that their heart starts racing. They might notice that they get an upset stomach. They might notice that they get more tension in their upper body. So it's quite a range of different experiences that people have on a physical level when it comes to anxiety. And indeed, I've had people say to me in the past that their experience of anxiety doesn't feel like a physical one, but they're aware of how their thinking has changed. And often, but not always, that thinking becomes very fast. I sometimes use the analogy of watching Formula One racing cars going around a track, and that's how people perceive their thoughts to be operating in their head. Like the thoughts are just whizzing by and you can't really latch onto any one of them for long enough to be able to figure that thought out or do anything productive with it. So as I mentioned before, anxiety can relate quite closely to other emotions, and they can at times become problematic. Now, we do all experience a sense of anxiety sometimes. You know, there are times when actually a little bit of anxiety might be quite helpful for us. So even when we're looking at things like negative emotions, our goal isn't to be rid of them, because they do serve a purpose for us. I mean, let's say that you were out on a lovely walk and you came to the edge of a cliff face, and then it was a huge, great big drop down to the sea, and it was filled with rocks down below you there. If you get too close to the edge, it's important that you feel a sense of anxiety in a situation like that, because that anxiety is then keeping you safe and giving you a warning that you need to step back from the edge. The reason why anxiety becomes a problem is when it shows up in situations and contexts where it is not necessary, where it's not required. But it's sometimes challenging to differentiate from what is a situation that should be anxiety causing and what is not. So there's a famous story of the musician Bruce Springsteen, talking about how when it was time for him to step out on stage and play to a live audience, he would get these very specific symptoms that told him it was time for him to get out there and start playing, and to, you know, basically really get the crowd up and rocking with him. And so he described that his palms would get sweaty and he would get this kind of churning, knotted feeling in his stomach. And he said, that's how I know it's time for me to step out on stage. And so it's easy there to sort of hear what he's describing and say, that sounds like a great sense of excitement that he was feeling about what was coming for him next. But similarly, in an interview with Carly Simon, who is also a singer, a musician, when she was describing a period of her life where she had stage fright, she said, I know it's time for me to start getting anxious and frightened about going out on stage, because I get sweaty palms and this knotted, churning feeling in my stomach. And that's how I know that it's time for me to start getting the stage fright. And so she described exactly the same feelings, exactly the same symptoms and sensations. But for her, she perceived those symptoms in a very different way. And so what we know is that anxiety and the feeling of excitement on a physiological level are very, very close. They're incredibly similar. And sometimes the difference that makes the difference as to whether you perceive this as an exciting situation or whether you perceive this as an anxiety-inducing situation, sometimes that difference lies in how you frame it to yourself and what you tell yourself. So I'm going to be sharing some important stuff with you today about how we talk to ourselves when it comes to anxiety and what we say to ourselves about it. So I've got some bits to share with you today. I've probably got like 3, maybe 4 key points that I think are really important when it comes to managing and also getting on top of and being able to reduce the level of anxiety that you experience. Not all of these tips and techniques are going to work for you. All right, so not everything I say is going to be exactly the right fit for you on a personal level, but some of it will be. So it's really about taking these different suggestions that I give you, running with each of them and seeing which ones sit with you best. And then the ones that you like and you think, yeah, I can actually see that really working for me in the future, like really work on those ones and put those ones into action the most. If there's anything that I say and you think, wow, that's not really how anxiety works for me, or that technique doesn't seem to make very much sense for me, that's fine, you can let that one go, but then put your focus onto the other ones. All right, so you don't need to throw everything in the kitchen sink at anxiety to get on top of it. You just need to find one solution that works really well for you and keep employing it. So the very first thing that I'm going to suggest to you, which is maybe a bit of a buzzword at the moment, and I feel like it's maybe sort of reaching a point of being a little bit overdone, but there is something in it, is mindfulness. Now, when I talk about mindfulness, I'm not just talking about the strategies that you perhaps have come across in pop culture, where it talks about, taking a moment to sort of center yourself and tune your senses into one particular thing. That's helpful. But really, anything that just gets you to stop for a moment, we could put under the umbrella of mindfulness. So for some people, they might find that meditation works really well for them. Other people like hypnosis. Other people find taking a walk in nature is what works for them. But really what we're looking to do here is to create that sense of putting your focus on just one thing. Remember how I said very often for people with anxiety, their thoughts become like a Formula One circuit, and there's just thoughts just whizzing around, and you can't really grasp onto any of them to be able to resolve them properly. What we do when we're using something like mindfulness, what this is really good at, is just kind of zeroing in and channeling our thoughts to just one particular place in that moment. And it just helps everything to slow back down again. So we talk sometimes about getting a sense of grounding yourself. And that's because from a metaphorical perspective, what very often happens for people when they're anxious is everything gets so hyped up, it's almost as if your feet aren't planted on the ground anymore. Like your brain's just gone into so many different abstract areas, you're not really grasping onto anything. Mindfulness is good for getting you grounded again, for kind of just getting you to sort of plant yourself where you are, and you can use your senses in a really easy and effective way. And I think sometimes people dismiss something like mindfulness because it seems so simple and so easy to do. It's like, how can that possibly be powerful enough to help with a strong feeling like anxiety? How's that ever going to work for me? But it does come down to practice and using this almost a little bit religiously. So people that are very into meditation might meditate 2 or 3 times a day, or if they meditate once a day, they might do it for 40 minutes. It's almost like it's a really big part of their psyche and who they are. And they do that because it works. So the more you can weave this stuff into your daily life, rather than just as an antidote to an anxious moment, the better it will work for you in the long run. So these sorts of techniques like mindfulness, meditation, hypnosis, and so on, are not just to rescue you at the moment that you need it. They're actually there because when you put them into practice on a regular basis, they reduce the tendency to become anxious in anxiety-inducing situations in the future. So they become a preventative measure for you too. So a really simple thing to do is to just tune into one of your senses. But I mean, like really tune into it. So for example, if I were practicing some mindfulness with you right here, right now, I could say to you, focus on something that you can see. That's one of your senses, seeing. Let's pick something that we can see. And if I were to look around my desk here, there's actually quite a lot going on. I've got my mouse mat, I've got my keypad, I've got a pen here, but that's just on a superficial level. So if we were going like really hyper focused with this, we might be talking about like, look at how the light bounces off of the surface. Look at the scratches or marks on that surface. Look at the texture of it. So that's where you really start to channel and fine tune your focus. If we were doing it with hearing, then you could say, obviously, you can hear the sound of my voice right now. Maybe there's some traffic noises or outside noises that you've got in the background. But if you were to be using this in a really hyper-focused way, then actually you might tune into things like the background hum of the traffic and the pitch of that sound. Perhaps you would notice how the tone of my voice at times peaks and at other times drops down, or where there are pauses, and perhaps you can hear the sound of your own breath in those pauses. So when we use mindfulness in this way, this is where it starts to really work for us, because we're not just on a superficial level going, oh, what can you feel? I can feel my bottom on the chair. But instead you go, what's the temperature like? What's the texture like? And then that's where it starts to slow your thinking down. And the more you zoom in and zero in on just one or two things, the easier it is then to kind of quiet all of the other stuff that might otherwise have been jibber jabbering away in the background. Now, very often when we start using these techniques, it's not easy. It's not easy in the beginning. I think that's why a lot of people fall off the wagon when it comes to things like meditation and mindfulness, especially with meditation. You know, with that, you are supposed to really clear your mind and focus on nothing. If you've ever tried to focus on nothing, you'll notice that within about 5 seconds, something happens. And the something that happens is normally an unwanted, like a thought that you do not need to be thinking at this moment in time, that just pops into your mind. But the more you kind of go and leave that, let's focus again and keep practicing that skill of bringing your thought back to just letting stuff go and having that peaceful, empty mind. It does get easier, but it's something that takes practice. And it is something that, you know, you literally need to put into daily practice in order to get those long-term benefits and to see anxiety as something that really starts to melt away from your life. So that is probably the least NLP type of intervention that I can suggest to you. The rest of what I want to share with you are really much more my bag, much more my field, and the sort of stuff that I find effective for me as someone who has a very busy brain, and so therefore has a tendency to get anxious in the moment and needs kind of quick fire, snappy solutions to it, aside from all of those longer term strategies we've just talked about. So I think one of the most important things that you can do if you are someone who has a tendency to become anxious is to start tuning into how you talk to yourself inside your head. And if you just thought to yourself, what's she on about, talking to myself inside my head? That's the talking to yourself inside your head that I'm talking about. All right. So that's your self-talk. So when you talk to yourself inside your mind, it has influence over how you end up feeling, behaving, and reacting. And the good news is that little voice belongs to you. And over time, you can learn to control it. But in the short term, you can also start to interrupt it. You can start to challenge it if it's saying unhelpful things to you, for example. So when we talk to ourselves inside our head, it very often has a tone of voice to it. And you know from previous experience of engaging with people in the real world that the tone of voice that somebody uses can really change the meaning and impact of what is being said. It works the same inside your head as well. So it's not just about the what you say to yourself in there. It's also about the how you say what you say to yourself in there, because you can give yourself a pep talk, but if you do it from a place of sounding internally as if you are uncertain, or that you feel a bit weak, or that there is just anything around it that has an element of unease to it, it's not going to effectively interrupt an anxious thought. In the face of an anxious thought, you've really got a couple of choices about how to deal with it. One is to be warm and fluffy and calm yourself down. And the other is to face up to it and stand up to it and talk to it in a way like you are not going to take any more of this nonsense from it whatsoever. So you need to start noticing, what does your internal voice sound like when you are in a state of anxiety? And then what's going to be the best strategy for interrupting it and what to say when you talk back to it. Now, let's say, for example, you had a worry thought in your mind, you had an anxious thought in your mind that was saying something like, I'm really worried that my boss is going to say that the quality of my work isn't good enough and it's going to be a really uncomfortable conversation. So let's say you had a thought like that going on. One of the best ways to establish how to respond to an ongoing thought like that is to think about how you would coach a friend if a friend came to you with that particular issue. Very often it's far easier for you to think about how you would respond to somebody else in a time of crisis than to sort your own problem out. Like, we're really good at sorting out other people's stuff, not so good at doing it for ourselves. So what you're going to do is you're going to think, right, if this was my best friend who came to me and said, I've got this worry, I'm worried about what my boss is going to say. Most likely the first thing you'd say to them is, well, what's going on behind that? What are you really worried about there? You'd find out a little bit more information and you'd see if you could, perhaps talk to them in a way that helped them to think about the problem differently. Let's imagine you did that and it didn't work and they continued to express just how worried they were. Then you might start slipping into tea and sympathy mode and maybe being super reassuring and saying kind things and telling them, that you're great at what you do. And I'm sure that even if you're struggling, your boss would want to put the right things in place to help you to get better. So you'd go through the sort of tea, sympathy, reassurance stage with them. Now imagine that friend still didn't stop and they continued to react in an anxious way. They're still freaking out, basically. What are you going to do next? Now, there might be some other things that you would suggest or say to help calm them and reassure them. But equally, you might get to a point where you say to them, all right, enough's enough. You're going around in circles here. This is not getting you anywhere. Pull yourself together. And you might have a bit more of a tough talk with them, where you say to them, that's enough now. This isn't taking us where we need it to take us. This conversation is going nowhere. Stop it. And actually, that might be the same conversation that sometimes you need to have with yourself. Sometimes in the space between our own two ears, we need to be saying to ourselves, enough's enough. We're getting nowhere thinking like this. If we're going to do something about it, do something about it. Otherwise, this just needs to come to a stop. So sometimes the right strategy, not always, but sometimes the right strategy is to get tough with ourselves and to basically have a word with ourselves, pull our own socks up, or pull an end towards the constant jibber jabber that might be going on inside our minds. So your self-talk can be incredibly powerful, but remember, the how you say it is going to have more impact than the what you say to yourself. So there's going to be a very big difference between you saying to yourself, I'm sure everything's going to be all right, and saying to yourself, I'm sure everything is going to be all right. All right, so one of them carries an air of certainty about it, whilst the other one sounds like you're falling to pieces. And that does still operate in the same way inside your head. So you need to make sure that you say what you say in the best possible way. So the next thing that I think is a really useful thing in times of anxiety is going back to what we mentioned at the very start there around the physical symptoms that we might experience. So, for example, very often when someone is anxious, not always, but I'm generalizing somewhat, they experience a feeling in their body that's happening somewhere between here and down to the bottom of their tummy. Like, normally anxiety is living in this area. It's either causing like fluttering in the chest or churning in the tummy or something along those lines, like some other kind of like tightness or discomfort that's going on in there. So in NLP, we have a particular set of strategies that we use, a specific set of techniques that we have that we refer to as submodality interventions. And a submodality intervention is a technique or a strategy which specifically works on a sensory experience. So a modality is simply another word for one of your five senses. So vision is a modality, hearing is a modality, feeling is a modality. A submodality is an extra bit of detail, so some extra distinction on one of your five senses. So a submodality of vision, for example, could be whether you see things in black and white, or whether you see things in color. It could be whether you see something as being up close or whether you see it as being far away. A submodality of hearing could be whether you hear the pitch as being high or low. Could also be volume, whether it's loud or whether it's soft. A submodality of feeling could be on a tactile level. So does it feel hot or does it feel cool? Does it feel hard? Does it feel soft? But also with our kinesthetic, so touch and feeling, it also relates to emotional feeling as well, of course. So submodalities of feeling could also be whereabouts in your body you feel that particular emotion. And of course, we have submodalities that relate to smelling and tasting, but I'm going to somewhat avoid those in this conversation because we tend here to be talking about how we're communicating with ourselves and how we're communicating with others. And you tend not to go around smelling and licking other people too much, I'm going to assume. So we're going to focus on what you see, what you hear, and what you feel. So with these particular submodalities, these are useful to us in an anxiety scenario because when you start noticing them and tuning into them, you'll also recognize that you can take control of them. As I said, sometimes when people have anxiety, they get some kind of physical sensation in this kind of solar plexus area in their torso that is causing a problem for them. So let's say, for example, somebody said that when they were anxious, they got a feeling in their chest that felt like a kind of whirring that was sort of spinning around, and it caused them to feel really nauseous and actually quite sick. When you ask someone about that feeling of nausea, if you say to them, can you make it go faster? So here we're looking at speed as a submodality. Usually they can. If they can make it go faster, it implies that they have some control over it, and therefore they can also make it go slower. Maybe they can also make it spin in the other direction, see what that does for them in terms of how that anxiety now feels. If someone has a feeling of perhaps a like pounding sensation going on, again, they can probably speed it up, which implies that they can also slow it down. If when someone is anxious, they notice that they see scenarios in their mind, perhaps of things that have gone horribly wrong in the past, or a time when they felt like really embarrassed or uncomfortable, then we can use the submodalities to change how they see the quality of that old memory, so the actual vision that goes with that memory. Often when we recall distressing stuff, we accidentally see it in color, high definition, with surround sound. So we really go for it in terms of making ourselves feel as bad as we possibly could do. Well, actually, you can change that. If you see that same scene, but you put it in black and white, well, you may know the answer to this already. Think about black and white movies. What do you know about black and white movies? Like, what have you come to learn about black and white movies as you've grown up? That they're old. So for our brains, we're already pre-programmed to think that if something is in black and white, it's old, it's possibly even out of date. So if you have a memory of an uncomfortable experience that you replay and it causes you to feel anxious, you can change that by changing the quality of how you see the old image that goes with the movie. And if you change it to black and white, your brain goes, oh, it's old. It will start to take away some of the emotional content that goes with it. Similarly, you might remember the sound of somebody's voice, you know, maybe when they expressed disapproval in some way, or if they said something that you found particularly hurtful. The reason why that works the way it works is most likely because of how they said what they said, and, you know, quite possibly some of what they said, but the how makes the difference. So if you hear that voice in your mind over and over again, then you can change it so that it doesn't carry the same impact anymore. If you think about somebody saying something that was embarrassing or insulting to you, but their voice sounds like Mickey Mouse, or as if they've just sucked on a helium balloon, it's not going to carry the same weight to it anymore. It just won't make you feel the same way. So what we're saying here is you start to take charge over what goes on in your head. It's really easy to buy into the belief that stuff just happens in your mind, and your mind does that to you and it does it for you, but that you're in some way not associated to it. You just kind of live with the ramifications of it. But you are your mind. You are the one that's driving the bus. You're in charge in there. But if you don't take charge, then that's when it feels like stuff just kind of crops up and happens to you in there, rather than you taking control and taking direction over it. And sometimes it would seem to be that our minds almost sort of create dramatic scenarios and make problems worse than they ever needed to be, almost as a bit of a form of entertainment. Sometimes that happens because someone is not pushing themselves in their lives as much as they could do. So your brain has a natural propensity to keep itself occupied, because it wants to keep growing and evolving. So if you do not set goals and challenges for yourself, then it's almost as if it goes, I'm a bit bored, gonna make some trouble now. And then you start to see all these little issues that start cropping up in life, such as anxiety, all these things that never would have made you feel anxious in the past suddenly start to become a problem. And it might just be that what you really need is a big worthwhile problem, otherwise called a goal, that helps to put all of those little annoying things into a better perspective for you. When you do that, actually those things that used to make you feel anxious kind of subside and shrink away a little bit. So sometimes what we need to be doing is thinking, does my brain need something else to keep it entertained so that it's not creating all these unnecessary dramatic scenarios for me to try and work through? Maybe there is something bigger that's actually quite useful and important to me that I could be setting my focus on here. So remember that you're in charge in there, providing you take charge in there, and that you can do that. You might get some resistance to begin with, and certainly using things like submodality interventions, where we're going in and making changes to old memories or current feelings and experiences by tuning into them on a sensory level and making changes and adjustments to them. Initially, that's not going to be something that comes to you naturally. You're not just going to kind of decide to do it and it happens. You might need to sit there for somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 minutes to be able to take proper control of it and to be able to change your direction in terms of how you're thinking in those moments. But if you think about how much time currently gets invested into feeling anxious, taking a couple of minutes to do a submodality exercise, or to talk to yourself in a more empowering way, or to even just do a couple of minutes of mindfulness, you know, a couple of minutes then is absolutely nothing, is it? You know, it's well worth the investment at that time to be able to regain control over your thinking and over your focus. If you don't do that, that's when it feels like this stuff happens to you and that you are not in control. You're not the one driving the bus anymore. One of the things that I think is really useful in NLP, but I also think almost kind of feeds into every NLP intervention that we do, is something called reframing. So if you think about a picture that you've got up on the wall in your house or in your workplace, if you stuck a different coloured frame around that picture, it's going to bring out different elements of that picture or that photograph, because it's going to, you know, cause certain undertones in colouring or contrasting colours to pop more than they might have done with the old frame that you used to have. So reframing is a little bit like that. It's when we put a different edge around an experience and it causes us to see the experience and experience the experience in a different way. It causes different elements of it to pop out and grab our attention. And so reframing often shows up in the work that I do. Sometimes a reframe is as simple as getting someone to think about a situation from a completely different perspective, or getting them to notice stuff that they otherwise would have missed. So it doesn't have to be something that's you know, very technical exercise to do. It's just about thinking, all right, if I turn this problem on its head or inside out, if I think about what else this anxiety could mean, or what else this situation is telling me, what else could there be? What else might it mean? And sometimes this shows up very naturally when we start communicating with other people. The reason why is because other people see life in a different perspective to you. We all do, to some extent. We tend to like the people that see situations from a perspective that is most similar to our own, because it feels like they're backing us up. But often the people that are most useful to us are the ones who see things from a completely different perspective, because they then get us to see stuff that we might not have been able to see or think of otherwise. And that's really what reframing is all about. I remember a long time ago when I was working in a private day nursery, and it was actually a really nice organisation. Like, on the whole, it was a good company to work for. And we very much had a like quite a good community spirit amongst the team of employees that work there. So, for example, lots of us would spend time together outside of work, and anytime it was somebody's birthday, there would always be a collection. And then at the end of the week, of your birthday week, you would be presented with an envelope that had a good wad of cash in it, because everyone would have stuck in, you know, a couple of quid for you. And even though everybody knew that this was a thing, that there was always, you know, if it was your birthday, you're always going to get birthday money. Even though everybody knew it, we always kept it quiet from the person whose birthday it was, that there was a collection going around. If you'd worked there long enough, you could guess, it's my birthday this week, it's probably a collection going around. Anyway, when it got to my birthday week, for whatever reason, it didn't occur to me that there would be a collection going around for my birthday. And I happened to be in a different room, and then I walked into the main room where I worked, where all my work colleagues were standing together, having a little chit chat with each other. And as I walked into the room, there was suddenly absolute silence. Now, you know that experience of when you walk into a room and it falls quiet, and you know that they had not finished that conversation yet. Like, that wasn't a natural ending to the conversation. This was just like abrupt silence. And it was caused by my entry into the room. And so what immediately happened for me was a deep sense of paranoia. On no level did I think this might be something good. Instead, I instantly became anxious and paranoid about what the conversation had been that was going on. And I started to get really worried. Now, my best friend actually worked for this organisation, and she was party to this very abrupt silencing of conversation that I walked in on. So although I didn't say anything at that time, later on, I said to her on the quiet, when I walked into the room earlier, was something being said about me? And she went, no, which just made things worse. You know, on no level did that reassure me that everything was okay. Like, I instantly knew that she was lying. So I said to her, I think you were. I think you were talking about me, and I'm actually really worried about it. And she was like, we weren't talking about you. And I was like, oh my God, I know you were. Like, you're making this so much worse for me. My brain had instantly gone to like worst case scenario stuff. And in the end, I pestered her so much because I was like getting myself in such a state that eventually she said to me, "It's your birthday. We were talking about the birthday collection for you." And I instantly felt like a complete idiot. I'm really embarrassed. Now, that's a situation that if I'd have been on better form that day, I might have been able to reframe it for myself. And in reframing it, I might even have established like the real reason why everyone fell quiet when I walked into the room. It would have been easy enough for me to say to myself, well, maybe they were talking about something that's going to be good for me. Maybe they were talking about something that they don't want to talk to me about yet because they haven't got all the facts together. You know, if I perhaps felt a bit more trust towards those people, then it might have been easier for me to see it from a different perspective. So there was all sorts of other avenues that I could have gone down in my mind, other than instantly assuming that this was something negative, that there was some kind of bad news coming in my direction. So when we learn to reframe, it's something that can almost work as a sort of self-reassurance. Now, for me personally, I find reframing really easy to do for other people, less easy to do for myself in the moment. But once I have paused and come away from something, maybe even slept on it sometimes, then giving myself that little bit of distance from the problem allows me to come up with some really good solutions and reframes that make me go, oh yeah, actually, I don't need to worry about this. It's probably just blah that's going on here. And that's because of something called creative distancing. So there was a study done in America in a university where they split a group into two separate groups and put them into two separate classrooms. And for one class, they said to them, we want you to imagine that you look out the window here and you see a great big field of corn. And your job for today is going to be to come up with as many creative ways as you possibly can to utilize that corn. Off you go. Then they went to the other class and they said, we want you to imagine that on the other side of the world, over in Europe, there is a field and it is filled with corn. And we want you to come up with as many different creative ways as possible to use the corn in that field in Europe. So the two groups kind of had the same problem to work on. The difference was distance. For the group that had the problem just outside the window, even though it was an imaginary problem, they came up with different ways in which they could use the corn, but their ideas were kind of low level. You know, they thought on just the sort of immediate types of things that you might think of, like maybe we can use the corn for food. When they gave the problem to the other group and said that the corn is a long way away, it's in Europe, it's far from you, they came up with ideas that were much more diverse and were much more abstract. So they were talking about like biofuels and all sorts of other like bigger concept type ideas. And that's because when we have distance on something, we tend to come up with better solutions to solve that particular problem. And this is why for me, when I need to do some reframing on a problem, sometimes I can't do it in the moment. Sometimes I do better if I've slept on it. Sometimes I might do better at reframing a problem if I like park it, go for a walk and come back. Like we've all had that, haven't we? Where you've been like racking your brains for something and then you stop thinking about it and then suddenly it's like, bing, oh yeah, of course, that's, you know, like you've forgotten someone's name or where you left your keys. As soon as you kind of like stop trying to fumble around and find the solution and just go, oh, let it go. As soon as you do that letting go, then the solution comes along. And anxiety can work for us in the same way, in that if you are experiencing an anxious time and you are also trying to problem solve your way through that, sometimes it works better to step away from that and let it go completely for a little while, because that's when you might come up with the best ideas to reframe the issue and to be able to resolve it. And finally, my final tip for you is, because we talked at the very start there about self-talk and how you would be so very effective and resourceful. If you were talking to your best friend and they had the problem, you'd come up with all sorts of amazing ideas about how to resolve it. It tells us that it's always easier to solve someone else's problem than to solve your own. So my final suggestion for you is that if you have a problem, if there is something in your workplace scenario which is making you anxious, talk to someone who can do something about it. Now, I say talk to someone who can do something about it because, as I mentioned, in my previous work scenarios, there were people that I was really good friends with. There were people that thought like me. There were people that would agree with me. And sometimes if I talk to them, all they would do is kind of back up the ideas I already had, which wouldn't necessarily take me towards a solution. You know, particularly if I was anxious about a workplace relationship. If I talked to one of my workplace buddies, they would probably take my side, but it's not going to sort out the relationship issue that I have with someone else. So we need to be really careful about who we choose to talk to when we're in the workplace. Talking to someone who can do something about it might mean talking to your boss, even if they're the person that you feel least comfortable having a conversation with. Talking to someone who can do something about it might mean reaching out to one of those people building practitioners who your workplace have employed to deliver a free consultation session to you so that you can learn the strategies that you need to learn to be able to deal with those anxiety inducing scenarios that you have in your workplace environment. So just think about communicating with people, but think very carefully about who it is that you choose to communicate with, because who you choose to share the problem with may lead you towards feeling a sense of resolution, or it might just make you feel right. And there's a difference. And you need to decide, like, where do you want to go with this? Do you just want to feel reassured that you're right, or do you actually want to resolve that thing that's causing the anxiety to happen in the first place? So think very carefully about who it is that you choose to talk to. And that is everything that I wanted to share with you for today, but I swear I could talk for another 3 hours giving you strategies around anxiety. So I'm going to hop back to Mark now and see, is there anything that I've missed that you wanted to ask me about at all, or any questions that came in there?
Not many live, but Carol, did you have any, or Callum or Abigail, or anyone that's listening, do you have any questions while you've got Gemma on the line, so to speak? I think you're muted, Carol. You need to unmute yourself.
I'm on mute, the famous quote of 2021. I think the last thing was quite interesting about who you talk to. Yeah, because my gut reaction, if I've got a problem with someone, I would go straight to that person and say, and try and sort of see A, if there is a problem, and then B, sort it out.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that there's a lot that you learn just through experience in the workplace. Obviously, this program for our Kickstarters, we're largely going to be attracting people that are maybe less familiar with being in the workplace. Their brains haven't necessarily fully developed yet. And so, they're perhaps coming out of environments such as schools where problems might have got handled in a very particular kind of way. And as employers, we might be looking for a change in that culture and for things to be handled a little bit differently. So I think it's an important one to mention that, absolutely talking is the right thing to do, but choose who you talk to very wisely.
Do you have any more questions, Carol, or Callum or Abigail, or anyone else?
They are here.
No, thank you.
Good stuff. Okay, so if no one's got any further questions, I think we just thank Gemma for her time. Have you got anything? Is there anything you wanted me to send out, Gemma, to everyone?
What I'll do is I'll ping you over an email just with some different resources and bits and pieces that people can circle back to. We have a YouTube channel as well, which is just tons of free content on there. So there's lots of stuff around all sorts of different, not just mental health and emotional challenges, but just kind of everyday stuff. So the podcast I recorded yesterday was about not taking things too personally for example. So we have a video that goes out once a month, and then that's also in an audio format, which then goes out onto different podcasting channels, such as Apple Podcasts and Stitcher and so on. So you can get an audio version there of it too. So I'll send you over the links to those, because those are really good resources just from a self-development perspective.
Okay, thanks for that.
Thank you. The stuff you mentioned earlier about black and white and changing of voices, I'm going to tell a friend of mine about that, because she's got quite a traumatic memory from when she was young, and it's affecting her in her day-to-day now, because she's frightened of traveling because of this. So it's interesting that how I was talking to her was sort of inadvertently using some of what you've said.
Yeah.
But now I know some more terms, and the black and white, putting it in black and white is genius. So I'm going to talk to her about that and see if she can reframe it.
Awesome, love that.
Yeah, I'd heavily recommend any individuals that have challenges in these areas or any mental health issues, get in touch with Gemma, or any employers that want to kind of offer a wraparound solution for mental health for their employees, because it's not really something that's covered by anything else in HR, so on and so forth. So yeah, I'd definitely urge anyone to look at that. But yeah, again, thanks, Gemma. It's a huge subject. It's not something you can fix in an hour, or it's not something you can cover every single part of the topic, is it? And if people have challenges in these areas, as most people do, either ongoing or situationally, or it's a huge area to fix, isn't it? So I'd encourage them just to engage with you and look at the other resources you've got and all those sorts of things. So thanks again.
Thank you very much. Lovely to see you all today.
Yeah, and hopefully, is there a couple more you're doing for us? I can't remember how many there is.
Oh yeah, I think I've got about 3 more coming up, so I'll be back.
Yeah, that's great. So I'll tap into those, everyone that's watching, whether you're watching live or watching on the YouTube channel afterwards, because I think you'll all agree Gemma's content's fantastic and really bit beneficial. Yeah. Okay, thanks everyone. Cheers, Gemma.
Cheers. Bye.